Morning, everybody. I'm Kathy Tunheim. Thanks very much for signing up and joining us for a second conversation about this extraordinary time as we think about potential investments from the federal government down to the state and local governments as we come through all the challenges we've collectively come through in the last couple of years. So, John, our first conversation, we had a chance to talk with some people about what their aspirations might be. Dave Kloss from St. Cloud, Tanya Allen from McKnight Foundation, and Myron Franz from the University of Minnesota. And my takeaway from that first conversation was we had great aspirations and not a lot of clarity about not only how much money was going to come, but whether we were set up to spend money the way that it might be coming at us. And so it seemed to set up this next conversation to say, who should be doing thinking about strategic change or transformational change or systemic change that might be possible because of this kind of money. So I'm thrilled to have some of the folks joining us today. They're joining us. What are you looking forward to most?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see you. And yeah, this is going to be an interesting conversation today. Our first sort of session was really about ARP, the American Rescue Plan, and how it was potentially being thought of and how it was going to get spent. And this is a kind of the follow-on conversation about what's next. And so today I'm going to set up a little bit of the first of a couple speakers that's going to give you some context to understand kind of where we're at now. As many of you know, the ARP money was signed last March and by the president, and it is in process now. So many cities and states are trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. We also have two other pieces of major legislation that's being considered now in front of the Congress. The what's called the infrastructure bill, which is the hard infrastructure bill, and then there is something called the human infrastructure bill. And to do that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Hine. Sarah is our Director of Public Affairs and Advocacy, and she is joining us from the North Shore. So thank you, Sarah. And why don't you give us a little bit of insight as to what's going on in DC as the context for our discussion today.
Thank you, John. And yes, I am coming from the North Shore today. So if something happens to my internet, I'm just going to apologize in advance for that and can send around the notes afterwards if that happens. But as John mentioned, a lot is happening in DC and a lot is changing very quickly right now when we're looking at some of our upcoming potential investments that we'll be seeing from our federal government. And there are a lot of side tangents, side conversations. If any of you are following it closely, you'll see Kristen Sinema was chased into a bathroom in Arizona this week. And there's lots of other things happening that we're not going to touch on here. I'm just going to touch on the highlights, but it's definitely an interesting time to be tracking and watching what's happening. As John mentioned, discussion is centered around two different packages. There's a $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then there's an even larger investment, which is being called the Build Back Better plan, riffing off of President Biden's initiative. And this is really an amount to be determined. The bipartisan bill is made up of more traditional infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, some climate transit investments, and the Build Back Better plan is more of that social infrastructure bill, including investments in climate, childcare, education, paid leave, really all of the social progressive priorities that were part of President Biden's agenda when running for president. Both of these bills are offshoots of one original Build Back Better proposal that was then split into two bills once Republicans made it clear what they would and what they would not support in both terms of dollars and policies. And the traditional infrastructure bill has gone through the traditional policymaking route. It has already passed through the Senate and went on to the House, where it was supposed to receive a vote last week, but we'll touch on that in just a second. And the Build Back Better plan is a little bit more cumbersome. It needs to travel through the Senate, through the reconciliation process that we've started to hear more about in these last few years, now that we have a tie in the Senate. And it, by traveling through reconciliation, that means it is not subject to the filibuster in the Senate and can pass with only Democratic support. And Senate Democrats did vote in favor of the budget resolution that would allow for the reconciliation process, but that's where the agreement really ends on that. there was no agreement on the top line dollar amount amongst Democrats. So it's really going through that negotiation process as it plays out through reconciliation. The problem is that the Democrats are not able to receive agreement on the top line dollar amount. Progressive Democrats are insisting that they want to deliver the president's full agenda, which would come at a price tag of about $3.5 trillion for just that Build Back Better plan. Democrats on the other side of the spectrum, such as Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema of Arizona, are refusing to support a bill with that price tag and have said that if it comes to the Senate for a vote, they will vote it down. So because the makeup of the Senate is that 50-50 split with Vice President Harris acting as the tiebreaker, every single Democratic vote is needed in order for the bill to progress and pass. So every single Democratic senator must be in agreement on that price tag. And that all kind of catches us up, brings us to last week, where there was a planned vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the House, which was also coinciding with needing to take some action to avoid a potential government shutdown that would start at midnight last Friday. And of course, we're coming up to this debt ceiling vote. So all of the votes that were to take place on Thursday evening, but at the last minute, Speaker Pelosi did pull the bipartisan infrastructure bill from taking a vote, because as they whipped the counts of the vote, it became evident the bill would fail because the House Progressive Caucus has said they will not support the bipartisan bill until a deal is reached on that Build Back Better plan, for fear that the Build Back Better plan will not materialize if the first investment already passes, as there's no, as Sinema and Manchin and other moderates will be bringing money back to their districts, to their states. The feeling is that they would no longer feel the need to negotiate on the additional investment. So I know this is all pretty complicated, and it just goes to show how much is moving and how quickly. But this has put both the fate of both the bills in uncertainty. It is set up not as Democrats versus Republicans in Congress, but we're really looking at progressive Democrats versus moderate Democrats such as Manchin and Sinema, and it's currently a standoff that where we're at right now, we don't see how that will end. And I think this shows two things right off the bat. One, it shows the growing power and influence that the Progressive Caucus has, as more and more progressives are forming. I believe there are now more than 100 members in the House. So they should now be considered an actual powerful voting bloc to really push the agenda of the Democrats in Congress. And then it also kind of highlights how policymaking in Washington is often not the will of the people or what the majority of the party in power wants. As you know, we're seeing really two single senators are standing in the way of the entire process moving forward. Of most Democrats in Congress overwhelmingly support the Build Back Better plan, but the way the Senate can operate and Congress can operate, two people can stand in that way based on how the numbers stack up. And it really highlights how it is difficult to track. It's hard to know what's happening in Washington and to follow all of those rules. And we are not talking much about Republicans in this conversation because they aren't in power, and they are generally sitting back to let the Democrats fight amongst themselves. The Democratic Party casts a really wide net. It's the party of Joe Manchin and the party of Bernie Sanders and the squad. So while Democrats are in control of all three branches of government, the ideologies are still quite diverse, and it's not as easy to move priorities forward. But I will say the one notable piece of this conversation that Republicans have been part of in this unpredictable and chaotic last couple of weeks is when it comes to the debt ceiling, with Mitch McConnell's decision to force the Democrats to raise the debt ceiling through their own reconciliation process, which is a bit of a shrewd move. It throws it back to the party that's a bit in chaos and forces them to take the lead in moving it forward to ensure that we do not default on our obligations. And also raising the debt ceiling is unpopular in a lot of Republican districts. So it allows the government to move forward, to not default by asking the Democrats, or really forcing the Democrats to raise the debt ceiling on their own without some Republicans having to take those hard votes when they go and talk about them when they go back to their districts. But all that's happening in Washington right now really points to two things. And one, the Democrats are going to be in trouble in the midterms if they don't deliver some meaningful investments when they alone control the federal government. With these small and slim majorities, to the general electorate, that doesn't matter. It just looks like the Democrats are being a bit dysfunctional by not being able to pass some sort of agreement. And we know the midterms are always difficult for the party that the president is in, but if they're not going to show some meaningful deliverables to the people, this could put them in even worse position in this next election. Well, I would say the next election after the local elections coming up, the next midterm election. And it shows that the lawmaking process is extremely opaque, difficult to follow, and requires a lot of time and effort to keep up to date, to keep tracking every nuance. And this process does shut out a lot of people and organizations that really would like to use this money transformationally, that have ways to focus on how we can get the money into our communities and make the changes that we need to make that we haven't really made in generations. So that those would be some things to watch. And I would say as of right now, as of last night, where do we go from here? Democratic leadership just signaled yesterday evening that they are in negotiations. The new deadline to pass both bills is October 31st. Manchin has come forward in the last week and said his top line spending amount is $1.5 trillion for that Build Back Better plan, which is of course less than half of the original proposed plan. And progressives are saying they will refuse to support that bill and leave so many investments they view as critical on the table. So Speaker Pelosi said last night that both sides are going to need to give a little bit. The progressives are going to need to come down. Manchin and Sinema are going to need to come up. Although I do not believe Sinema has given a top line number, I think most people are looking at her following Joe Manchin's lead in what her top line number will be. And of course, these discussions are happening right now behind closed doors, which makes it a little bit harder for people to play a part in that process. And President Biden is also part of those conversations. So as we're here today to talk about some transformational ways to make those investments, it is important to note that those investments are not a foregone conclusion. They're very much still in this deal-making process, and really and anything could happen and anything could fall apart at any time. So in order to have these investments to make, if your organization has wants, asks, cares for this funding, now is the time for any organization to be really ramping up advocacy efforts. This is a really critical month to see what the future of what this funding will look like and determine how it comes to the states and for what purposes. So we would suggest at Tunheim here that you're ramping up your advocacy efforts, even in a state where our lawmakers and our congressional delegation is not currently at the forefront of some of those negotiations with the centrist Democrats. Knowing that they are there, they're talking to their colleagues and they're pushing will certainly help. So with that, that is an update from Washington given via the North Shore, and I will turn it back over to my colleagues here.
Good morning. I am Emily McGrath with Tunheim, and I would like to introduce my colleague Arick, who's a guest contributor to CNN and a development partner at Tunheim, who worked with Mayor Bloomberg for a decade. Hi, Arick.
Hey, Emily, how are you doing?
Good. Good morning. I have a couple questions for you. First off, from your point of view, how has political media coverage changed during the pandemic?
That's a really interesting question. And, remarkably, if no one thought this was possible pre-pandemic, I think what we've gone through the last 18 months has certainly laid bare that, we can become more divided than we were before. And I think that it's remarkable. We're dealing with two separate countries, two culturally separate countries, each highly distrustful of the other. And I think that, putting my media cap on for the moment, I think the media takes advantage of that because that creates conflict. At the end of the day, politics is a bunch of human stories. We love the intrigue. Right now, as Sarah was just talking about, it's Manchin and Sinema holding up the entire Democratic agenda. It's the progressives versus the centrists. on a broader scale, it's the Trump loyalists versus the never Trumpers versus the Democrats in general. So I think, we love that intrigue in the media because that's what generates a lot of eyeballs. And unfortunately, what that means is that a lot of times that human intrigue is the spark that fuels a lot of these stories. But then when we get into the nitty gritty of the policy, the actual allocation of funds on a federal level, as we're going to be talking about later today, I think we really find that, the media's attention wanes. And as a result, if you're watching the news, even if you're a news junkie, you tend to see much less coverage about some of these policy issues and how they're actually implemented. So I think that, certainly, but since COVID, there's been this sense that, this is a country that's actually kind of ripping apart itself at the seams, but there's more. I think that COVID is not just the pandemic. I think that certainly the issues surrounding and emanating from the George Floyd situation have really put sort of social justice issues on the front burner, if you will. So you see, whether it be from the Fox more conservative perspective or whether it's sort of MSNBC and CNN on the other side, weaving that social justice narrative into the different themes. And also, I think you see that with one of the other major themes, which really isn't the focus of today's talk, but I think everything's related, right? It's the whole suite of issues surrounding voting rights, and that's sort of a reaction to the 2020 election. I mean, we see because of what happened in 2020 in the election of Biden, some elements of the Republican Party are seemingly hell bent in terms of creating sort of a situation that's going to limit the access of Black and brown voters at the polls, and at the same time, delegitimizing any election that by casting a lot of doubt on some of these past elections in 2020, delegitimizing the idea that sort of any election where a Republican doesn't come out victorious in a red or purple state is delegitimized to begin with. So I think we're seeing a lot of these different trends from a macro scenario playing out in a post-COVID media world.
So Arick, what do you think should be the media's role in framing up the issues for this amount of potentially transformational funding?
Well, what they should do and what they will do are actually two different things. I mean, what I think, what I've been an advocate for is really, for example, we take a look at the American Rescue Package. I mean, there was so much intrigue about, the negotiations, what was going to be in it, how big was it going to be, was it going to get passed, all these different things. But now that these monies are pretty much out there, there's very little coverage. You have to actually be really good at Google to figure out, what states and cities are spending this money and how they're doing it. And I think that really sort of speaks to the issue that, the media moves on, but a lot of these packages and these policies, and when they're coming down to the implementation level, they're not really being tracked in the way that you think. So if you are someone who's sitting there as a civic leader in a private company, or if you're a policy wonk, or even an elected official, and you're relying on the media to get your information, that's probably not going to be your best bet. I think that there's obviously different organizations that are more niche-y that are covering this issue, but in reality, if you're just someone who's checking out sort of prime time on the news channels, you're not going to get a lot of coverage about this. So I think that you need to really be proactive if you want to really find out what's going on, and I think a lot of that is good old-fashioned civic engagement. Getting in touch with your elected officials on the state, local level, figuring out exactly how they're thinking about some of these things. There's part of the American Rescue Act, by the way, was set up so that prominently featured, I believe was the language, on municipal and state websites was supposed to be some sort of portal into how these funds are being dispersed. And that's, as we find, that's actually not the case. In many regards, you have to really be a sleuth to find out, if at all, where these monies are going. And I think that, you need to, we had an old adage in the Bloomberg administration, which was, you need a seat at the table, but this is not reservations are sometimes hard to come by. So, for the most part, you need to be able to walk in and find your own table and make sure you have a seat at that table, because that's where the decisions are really being made. And so I think that, relying on the media, unfortunately, to get good information about sort of the implementation of some of these things is probably not going to be the best bet.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for help framing it up for us. I really appreciate it. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Emmett Coleman. Emmett? There he is. Also from the North Shore. Your volume's off, Emmett. Emmett, you're on mute. Still on mute.
Hey, Emily, that's Kathy. Let me just jump in. Oh, there he is.
There we go.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you, Emmett. Let me just jump back in while he's trying to do that. This is Kathy Tunheim again, and welcome Jeff Hayden, former senator, Minnesota legislature, and he and Emmett were preparing to do a conversation about, in addition to the limitations on what the media can illuminate for us, we have the context of just a hyper-partisanship across the continuum that needs to be understood as having changed our capacity at the state level to make decisions together. We asked Jeff to come in and give us, illuminate a little bit about what he anticipates is the environment as these funds come toward the state of Minnesota. What's the process for making decisions here within the state, and how the game may have changed in some important ways. Welcome, Jeff. It's great to have you here while Emmett's working out his technical problem. Give us just some top line kind of thinking based on the conversations you've heard so far.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. And I'm so sorry that Emmett isn't able for us to have the conversation. We've been talking about this formally and informally for a while. So sorry, Emmett, for that. I was looking forward to having this conversation in front of everybody that Emmett and I often have privately. So I think Arick really kind of summed up some of the issues there. And in particular, I want to focus in on what Arick had to say about, like, how does the states and then counties and then cities solicit information? How do they know kind of what their communities want? And so, one would say, well, you're an elected official. I was for 12 years, and that you should be in close contact with your district and kind of what people want. You have a structure inside the legislature or inside your county board or your city council that really kind of deals with a lot of the issues that the ARPA money is going to kind of help with. So one would say that, it should be pretty easy and seamless. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is, and Arick hit on this as well, is just politics, and Emily as well, politics in of itself, right? So not just about, if I come from the Iron Range here in Minnesota or Southwest Minnesota in the agriculture country, or I'm, in the outer ring suburbs or in the inner city or the metro area that I represented, the issues are different in terms of what people need and the emphasis on what they need. The second thing is the politics are different. So the issue of how do Republicans and Democrats think about, this issue. What I found interesting to some extent was that there's a lot of money, right? State is $2 billion, and the counties here in Hennepin, they have $250 million. City of Minneapolis had $271 million, and it's proportional down from there. That's money that needs to get out the door. So in very traditional ways, you'll find more conservative folks in the Republican Party who thinks that that's a lot of government spending and are a little reticent about getting it out in a very traditional ways. Liberal, progressive Democrats, who, like myself, who see these social programs, think that they're important, want to close gaps, right? They want to spend the money, but the money has to get out the door. So you have to start to figure out the priorities. The one thing I would say, and we talked a lot about this, was one, to resist the temptation of spreading the peanut butter on, think of that analogy, spreading the peanut butter on the bread all the way around, just a thin layer so everybody gets just a little bit, but you're not making the impact. You're not figuring out, what do we need? What is the transformational change? How do we close the achievement gap? how do we achieve health equity, especially now in the middle of a pandemic where it's shown up that people of color, African Americans, people of color die disproportionately, have more complications from COVID. So we're watching, we're feeling that in our communities, right now. This issue around, policing, but also community violence. Like, there's a policy agenda that's talking about policing that may have less to do with air or ARPA dollars, but there is this issue about community-based violence and what is driving that, and a lot of it is these very gaps that we have here. So there is a lot of conversations on how do we talk to community, but better yet, and Kathy and Emmett, we both talked about this, when we go and talk to our community, first of all, how do we talk to them? Is it just a website that's buried with people, that someone that may or may not have technology? So how do we go out and have those conversations proactively, right? And then talk to them. And then better yet, when they tell us what they want, do we believe them? And then are we going to take what they say and move it forward? Or are we going to interpret that, put it through this political machine, put it through our own filter, and then give people back what they want? Is it, go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, Jeff, one of the things that I want to make sure it came up early in this discussion, and I'll use this moment here to say it. One of the things that I'm starting to understand about what's going on still in Washington is the debate is not only what the dollar numbers are, but over what period of time are we talking about spending some of this money. And I wondered, as you think about that as a state level decision maker, that has to be a part of this too, to understand that we're talking about the opportunity to do something more transformational goes up if you're talking about something that's not actually a one-time money, but rather is an investment over a period of time. Yes. Does that play into how you guys think about how this gets talked about as we understand this kind of wall of money coming at Minnesota, but it's not in one big chunk? Is that?
Yeah, no. And thank you for that. I think that the sustainability, how do you do it so that it's just not like, as you said, a one-time thing and then it's done, especially when it comes to human capital and human infrastructure. Physical infrastructure, like there's a pothole, there's a bridge that needs to be repaired, there's a water plant that needs, redoing. That one-time money actually works because that it will last over the life of whatever you're trying to fix. When you're dealing with people, it does take a sustainable model, something that's transformational, something that is going to kind of close those gaps and figure that out. The other thing that I don't think that people talk about as much is there is a lot of federal guidance that comes with how you use the money. And so states, cities, and counties are also grappling with making sure they do it right so that they don't get in trouble down the line when like the OIGs or the inspector generals come back to make sure and that money doesn't get clawed back out of your general fund. I know that that's a little wonky and a little esoteric, but I know that that is a concern.
Yeah, no, I think actually it's a critically important point. And so as we talk about when and how should various stakeholders be engaged in this process, I think undergirding Tunheim's whole interest in this series is trying to get us all thinking about when and how, who should be paying attention when in this process to try to shape what ultimately happens. And the whole idea of even federal guidance and sort of the strings and attachments that come along with decisions that come out of Congress, I think is something that we all probably underestimate. So you're highlighting it, that's an important piece even now, to be trying to make sure that the guidance that comes along with the money allows for transformational change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can do both. I think we can figure out how to talk to our communities. I think we can make we can have a plan now. For instance, I'll just say it because I've talked about it all summer. I think, for instance, one of the things we need to do with young people is give them a summer job, right? And then hopefully that summer job kind of moves into a fall or a spring job. And the way that we should do it is we should look at kids that are on the free and reduced lunch, or young people free and reduced lunch, right? Pay them kind of a minimum wage, $15 an hour, whatever that is, give them 4 hours, a week. But then the business community and others can come in, say on Fridays, and then sit down and talk to the young folks about, financial planning and, thinking about their future or whatever. I think that there are kind of things that we can do then, but then at the same time, start to look at the medium and long range transformational things that we can do in which to kind of give them a path to move forward. I'm particularly sensitive to that because here in Minneapolis, unfortunately, we're headed towards a pace on homicides that we don't like to see. And 85% of those homicides are in the African American community, mostly with African American men, but increasingly more African American women and children. And so I in my mind, in a very practical way, I got to figure out how to get these young people to make better choices and decisions by getting caring adults. That's a specific policy, but at the same time, we need to do things. And you're going to have some wonderful folks to talk to you. I work with Tawanna and I work with Commissioner Bishop and others to think about what are those really structural changes that I won't get into because they're the experts that we can do. So I think that those, are things that we can do. But I do think that civic engagement for all that are listening to figure out how do we get the people a little bit closer to the policymakers to help them guide what this looks like is really the opportunity we have here.
Thank you, Jeff. And Emmett, I guess we still can't hear you, but you fed me one question I want to wrap up with, Jeff, and that is put you on the spot a little bit and talk about your confidence level that at the regional level, at the state level, can we overcome our hyperpartisanship and find ways to make decisions together for Minnesota?
I really do. I have a lot of confidence in my former colleagues at the legislature that I work with a lot now. I think that they want to do the right thing. I think that as they come together, because there'll be a mandate to spend this money, I think that they'll come with a path. They may have some problems on the general fund and trying to figure that out, especially in a year that they don't have to spend that money. And then at the county level, I'm really confident. And then at the city level, we have a little bit of a different issue because it's not kind of hyper partisanship. It's really in Minneapolis in particular, it's really Democrats trying to figure out like how do they kind of get that money out the door. And we have an election cycle, but I am really confident that there is a lot of needs out there, and that we're going to kind of attack those needs, and we're going to kind of get our footing and kind of get these resources out the door in a very thoughtful way. Great.
Thank you very much. That makes me feel better. that even someone who has seen the partisanship heightened has confidence that when it comes back around, we can do the right thing for our fellow citizens. Jeff, thanks very, very much for being with us.
Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Emmett, I'm sorry we didn't hear your voice, but you've contributed to the conversation and we appreciate that. So thanks for being with us. I am going to invite some additional guests onto the screen right now. Laura Bishop, who is now the principal of Purpose Strategies, but comes to us after having served the state of Minnesota as the commissioner of the PCA most recently, and an executive at Best Buy for a number of years before that. Laura, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Tawanna,
glad to be here.
Great to have you here. Tawanna, who's coming to us from on the road someplace. Are you in Nashville, if I got that right, or someplace, right, Tawanna?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for joining us. Tawanna is the CEO and founder of the Center for Economic Inclusion, a Minnesota-based organization, but working around the country on a range of issues and activities, I should say, and tools, all focused on encouraging a more inclusive economic development and a more vital and inclusive economy, I should say, for all of us. So it's great to have you here with us, Tawanna. And last but certainly not least, my friend Tim Welsh, who is the vice chairman of US Bank, based here in Minnesota. And he brings that perspective, but also the perspective of being the current chair of Greater MSP, an organization most of us are familiar with, champions for economic vitality for our entire region, a multi-sector organization. So Tim, thank you for joining us as well. I'm going to ask each of you to just share a few opening thoughts based on what you've heard so far from my colleagues. Optimist, pessimist, how you feeling about the path we've got ahead of us to try to, do we have additional investments coming from the federal government, and are we well positioned to use them effectively? Laura, maybe I'll put you on the spot first.
Sure. Hi, Kathy, and thank you so much for having me here this morning. I think that the state is well positioned. There's been certainly there's a disconnect between what state leaders know about the funding that has gone to the cities and counties. And I experienced that during the legislative session where the Senate and the GOP was really focused on wanting to get as much money down to the local levels as possible, but not knowing that the counties had already received $62 million in direct funding. So there's pieces there that I think that disconnect, that we need to have kind of an entity that pulls us together to understand what holes might need to be plugged and what there already is there. I think the other piece that's really interesting is, the cities and counties have received money and have the potential to receive more, and they have a lot more flexibility in, their meeting schedules, bringing people together than the state legislature does with, having to call a special session or having to do it within sessions. Minnesota is pretty well positioned to bring people together. And we've seen the governor, call a number of special sessions over the past, year and a half with the pandemic. But we've also seen that disconnect just between parties there at the state. But I feel pretty optimistic that there are tools in place, and I can talk a little bit more later about what those tools are, but I feel pretty optimistic that the state themselves can pull this together and look across.
Thanks so much. Tawanna, how about you? You watch this from a different vantage point. Are you an optimist?
I am an optimist who's realistic. I think Sarah really outlined the conditions that we face in Washington right now. And one of the things I heard her underscore was power and where power is held, the need for power to be more transparent. And one of the inherent facts around power and that we focus on a lot in our consulting is the conditions of systems change and the need for people to understand not only where power is held and the levers to pull in order for that power to be shared, but how are decisions going to be made? What's the transparency about how those decisions are going to be made? And when and where can I enter in order to influence those decisions? And I thought what was just shared here, I hope we can advertise as much as possible for those organizations and people who want to influence decisions in Washington. And as these dollars flow into our state, want to have the opportunity to influence them. And I think as we've watched dollars flow, not only these, but if we think about the decisions that are being made right now and over the last couple of months around the frontline worker pay, we've seen the same stalemate take place in St. Paul as we've had folks arguing over which frontline workers really are deserving of resources in order to care for their families. And I'm quite disappointed about that stalemate, quite disappointed about our governor being forced into a corner around being able to care for workers who went to bat for all of us because he was forced into a corner. I'm glad to see you here, my friend Laura, but after having some of his greatest workers forced out of positions and then being forced to say, do I lose more commissioners or do I make sure dollars go to some of all of the frontline workers, right? And so I think now we're in that same position of risking, do we see our own state policymakers continue what we're seeing in Washington based on what we've just seen happen with the frontline worker pay? Or do we see some shakeup? Do we bring transparency to these decision-making processes right now so that we don't see that same type of behavior take place in our legislature? And so that we make sure those policymakers who have the best interest of our economy and all Minnesotans know that they have enough support and enough advocates across the state, across sector lines and across party lines who are going to drive accountability, but also drive equity and inclusion.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you so much, Tawanna. I'll be back to you in a second here. So Tim, how about you? You come from a vantage point of having access to information as a leader of a very large organization, a vital company in our midst, but you're also bringing together this cross-sector conversation at Greater MSP. An optimist as you hear the kind of the setup of the discussion today, and where does your optimism come from, if that's where you're landing?
I am optimistic. First of all, Kathy, thank you for having me, and delighted to be here with all of you. I'm quite optimistic, and the reason I'm optimistic, Kathy, is as was alluded to by Arick and Sarah. Part of what we need to keep in mind is the federal government has already, through the American Rescue Plan, created pools of dollars that are competitive for regions to go after, right? So Laura highlighted the fact that some money went directly to cities and states for a whole variety of things. That's happened, and that's very good. And there is money available through the American Rescue Plan and then potentially Build Back Better, which are competitive grants. And the reason I'm optimistic, Kathy, is that our region, because of the tradition of collaboration that we've had in this region through, companies, communities, nonprofit organizations, we are actually extremely well positioned to go after and develop great proposals for these competitive dollars. Greater MSP is part of the mix on that, working very closely with Tawanna and others to create a series of proposals, which I'm happy to go through, Kathy, if we want. But I actually think that this is an opportunity for us to do what we do best: collaborate across sectors, have a strategic view, and put together proposals that will do exactly what Tawanna was just talking about: create jobs in a very inclusive way and bolster this economy. So I'm very optimistic because I think this plays to our strength of great cross-sector collaboration, Kathy.
Great, great. Well, as I've said a couple times already in the course of this session today, and we tried to project in promoting this session, I think at Tunheim, we look at this and say, it seems important to keep asking the question, who should be paying attention to all this process? How do they get a line of sight of what's happening? And how do they become engaged and have the opportunity to impact what could turn out to be once in a generation kind of investments in our region? So Laura, let me come back to you as somebody who, again, until recently was, my words, the Walz administration's point person on our thinking about climate and both mitigations and adaptations and so on. So I'll ask you the question this way: what's your sense of the role state government, maybe specifically, and public sector more generally, can play in creating architecture for transformational change? Can the government play that role?
I think they can. And when I was in the administration, just in the first few months of the administration, we pulled together across all the different agencies a climate subcabinet that then the governor codified through executive order. And really what that did is it was 15 different state agencies and entities that really were looking at that cross-sector work, so that you weren't bucketing it just in, the DNR or the PCA or ag, that you were looking at it across all the different agencies. And with that, I mean, we had Minnesota Housing in there, and they are, and Department of Labor and Industry, Commerce. And then there's also set up a structure where there's an advisory committee to the subcabinet. So, and those are from outside organizations that include academia, the business sector, our ag partners, as well as our advocacy community. So the environmental community, and we have representatives in that group from Copal as well. And so there's a system and a structure that has been set up to be able to look at this more holistically. And it saw results this last session. Not much that has been talked about yet, but we, as an administration, really looked at how we put together a climate package and bring that to the legislature. And so with that, there were successes: $460 million worth of climate budget that was passed this past session. And that's everything from, electrification on vehicles to our natural and working lands, to the tree nursery, to the Eco Act, to buildings and modifications. So there is that cross look that's there. And with it, there's also different funds that have been set up. So the legislature passed into law a climate resiliency funding fund for $1 million. And this really is to look at that money that comes in from ARP that could, and from the spending and climate package that could go into such an account and then be a competitive grant process with our communities. In addition, like the climate subcabinet right now is doing this conversation and asking for input from communities on our Minnesota climate and starting that discussion, what do you need in your communities? And we've seen one-time spending work really well. In Duluth, for example, the seawall that they've now built up that is really fantastic for climate resiliency and adaptation. They've had to do this, but again, that one-time funding can go pretty far when it relates to climate and on rebuilding our climate infrastructure, whether it's our stormwater or our water treatment plants, but building those not to, just, piece together plans for the next 20 years, but to look at those investments as very far out and to handle this extreme weather that we've seen now.
As people look to understand more about that planning kind of thinking that's going on at the state level, where is the access to that information? How should people?
Yeah, I think the best place, especially on the environmental stuff, is to look at, and the climate is to look at climate.state.mn.us. That is a whole website that's been set up to have that conversation around climate, but also to talk about where those different aspects and that they're looking at. I know the administration was also working on a climate action plan as well, and all of this funding, really will feed into how that will play out. I'd say the other piece that's really interesting that comes from climate funding, and Tim can talk about this from a regional investment, but there's opportunities that could be in that package for businesses as well. And, we saw it when I was at Best Buy, where under the stimulus funding, there was a real effort to take out kind of the old appliances that were not energy efficient and how this can contribute to greater climate resilience. But so the businesses can engage in these type of efforts as well. Or even a while back when Best Buy participated in the digital TV transition, that was a whole effort together with community that they led nationwide to bring in communities and to get especially our underserved communities more involved in the transition so that nobody was left behind. And it was with funding from the government to get those set-top boxes out to communities. And that was a real combined effort that I think businesses can look to those types of models, for example, on how that funding could be there for the betterment of the community.
We're going to come back around to that. Laura and I have had a little bit of chance to talk about this whole notion of, as you watch ESG strategies of corporations, how much of that is driven by corporate citizenship and how much of it is just really great business. And of course, the answer is both. So we'll come back around to that. Tawanna, you have been a leader here in the region and around the country in insisting on building our visions of economic vitality around the commitments to inclusion. Do you see this current environment of potentially lots of investment flowing through levels of government as, seems to me, obviously it could be an accelerator, but it could also be a distraction? How do you imagine doing this work in ways that we ensure that we make progress on all of our priorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we certainly see this as an accelerator and one that has to happen, right? So dollars of this size are transformational dollars. And if we look back in 10 years and 20 years, because while these dollars give us an opportunity to spend over a number of years, unlike the CARES Act dollars that required cities and counties and states to spend rather quickly, it still isn't a long amount of time when you look over the horizon of impact that we have to have. It does give us a chance to have impacts that will be long lasting. And I am saying to every policymaker, every agency lead that we talk to, if we don't see 10 and 25 and 50-year impact from these dollars, shame on all of us who work in government, all of us who influence government. We have to take this moment to pause long enough to be transformational. And that means it will be an accelerator if we go about the work right. And I think Jeff lifted up something about how we engage community, how we listen to community, and how we believe community. And I couldn't agree with that more. I would build on that to say there's this opportunity to be sure it's not only a moment to listen and engage and believe from a distance, but to say, how do we invest in those local and state government agencies and departments right now in a way that's also about bringing community in, such that we are more and more and more proximate to the very problems and solutions that we're trying to address. Right now, so many agencies, particularly in states like Minnesota, are saying, well, but wait a minute, we don't reflect the diversity with which we're trying to address. So it gets hard. I'm at IEDC's conference right now, excited for Ramsey County to hopefully come back with an award for the economic competitiveness and inclusion project we built for them. And we're talking to cities and counties all over the country who are saying it's so hard. We can't find planners. We can't find economic developers of color. What do we do? Well, as we're building back the budgets of city and county departments and state departments, we have an opportunity to also think about jobs and talent in economic development and in planning, and say, how do we bring in workers and train and develop in housing and urban planning so that these departments do reflect our communities? How do we start to value talent in different ways? It isn't being an expert in your neighborhood, some expertise that may be different than a degree in urban planning, but is still valuable expertise in understanding what works in your neighborhood and your community. And how do we start to value that differently? I think also one of the biggest investments that we're encouraging cities and states to make is in growing Black businesses, growing those businesses in the growth sectors that are going to drive the local and regional economies of their states. In Minnesota, we've got the large concentration of large corporations, as we know. We also know those corporations made commitments to spend with Black businesses to the tune of over $500 million in just our state alone. But they made those commitments pretty broadly. If we don't have the base of businesses that they can purchase from, that means that over the next 5 years, those dollars will go out of our state when they could have been in our state, by simply us investing in growing and scaling businesses owned by Black people in the right sectors and industries. But it'll take us being smart about that and dreaming bigger and bolder than we've dreamed before and aligning our sector investments. It's possible, but it'll take us getting out of our own way, being very proximate and engaging and believing people when they speak, as Jeff articulated earlier, and partnering together in that way that Tim referenced before, this very joint together that we talked about in launching the center 4 years ago. It's going to take us really doubling down on that, showing the proof of evidence through our data, but also our relationships. And it's very much possible. And I think this is the accelerator that we've needed.
Thanks so much, Tawanna. Tim, one of the things that strikes me as I'm looking at the screen and thinking about all three of you have brought real leadership in our region to being at the intersection of sectors, the public, private, nonprofit sector, and so on. And certainly greater MSP is a highlight of that for us. Talk about, sort of picking up on Tawanna's last comment, how do we see the ability of our region to get better at really hearing from all the stakeholders as we make some of the decisions that need to get made about investment of this extraordinary time? How do we get confident that we are in fact hearing more broadly from the stakeholders than we perhaps have been attuned to doing in the past? You talked about how good we are at collaboration. We need to get even better at it. It's kind of what I'm hearing.
I think there's no doubt about that. And I think Tawanna has been one of the many thoughtful voices about this point. And I do think what we got a couple of things, Kathy, that I would highlight as we think about how to make sure that there are as many voices at the table as possible. So, Tawanna just highlighted something really important, which was something called Business Bridge, which is a group of all of the largest companies in town who have committed more than a decade ago. The Business Bridge has been going on for a decade, with many of the largest companies committed to buying Minnesota from Minnesota-based companies, and that they have materially affected the region's GDP, going from about $7 billion of spending on Minnesota-based companies to about $10 billion of spending. In an economy that's $300 billion, to about an incremental $3 billion, 1% of GDP, that's pretty impressive. And what Tawanna has highlighted now is we can take that mechanism and work with groups like the Center and countless other groups to say, how do we then do the incremental $500 million that she just talked about for Black-owned businesses here primarily, but also nationally. And Tawanna, I take your point, we want to do it here, right? So what's good, Kathy, I think, is we had a mechanism in place, and we have great leaders like Tawanna and others now, also, Marcus Owens and the Alliance of Alliances and others, who can help us channel those voices to make sure that the mechanisms are working for everybody in the community. So I think that's a very powerful example that Tawanna raised, and I'm grateful for her active leadership in that. A second example, I would say, Kathy, is around what we're doing with the American Rescue Plan and going after the competitive dollars that I alluded to earlier. Back in 2013, Greater MSP and the University of Minnesota and lots of others recognized that food and biosciences were a huge part of this economy, right? You don't have to think too hard about that. But, one of the things that came out of that was something called MBOLD, which is all of the food companies in town working together to foster innovation and food security, among other things we're doing on the food side. Well, that creates a platform now for us to think more holistically about bioinnovation and what we can be doing to, appealing for the dollars to do exactly what Tawanna said, which is to make sure that 25 and 50 years from now, we have a much more diverse bio-food economy here. So I think, Kathy, the point is we've got a lot of mechanisms. We have some muscle memory in how to collaborate, but we need to do it, as Tawanna and others have said, to make sure we're involving community in often as possible, and then to bring together really disparate voices. Biodiversity and bioinnovation is a huge topic, right? How do we bring the you and the businesses all together? That's a role that Greater MSP and among others can help play. But I think we've got some of the muscle memory. We just need to practice it in new ways, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. And Laura, can we take the conversation we were just having about the bio business and apply it to climate? Talk a little bit about what you started to see in collaboration from largest companies to advocacy. How do we think about the clean economy as another context for what we're talking about here?
Sure. Well, just even on the bio and food area, as Tim was talking about, I mean, we've got great companies here in Minnesota that are doing just this, So if you look at General Mills or Land O'Lakes and, their system of how they are working to protect the climate by starting with their growers and looking and suppliers and making that so much more local in how food is delivered. And I mean, that's their primary business, and safety as well. So you're just seeing this sustainable ag and systems being driven by so many of the companies that are right here in the state. I think, and they all know that, climate change is a significant risk to their businesses. So how they do that investment to both maintain the livelihood and success of their business, as well as how that success then trickles and goes directly to their suppliers and partners, I think is a really great piece of the conversation. So you do see that. And again, these ESG commitments that companies are making and that shareholders are expecting of public companies are to work in community with community to achieve results. And I think that's being driven more and more, and we're seeing that. And so I love these, what Tawanna talked about, the investments that the companies are making with minority businesses. And again, it will be up to the shareholders, but the employees have an active voice in this as well, and community to hold them accountable to those commitments. And I think they will.
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about one specific topic that comes up in the context of what I think John Blackshaw at the top of this show called this kind of the soft infrastructure, the human infrastructure. How do we think about transformationally about our children, childcare, whether we think of it as an investment in the long-term future, whether we think of it as an investment in workforce? Who needs to be paying attention to what's being talked about in Washington on that front here in Minnesota? And how should we try to imagine seeing real forward progress made on that topic. And I'll kind of open it up. Who wants to jump in first?
I'll jump in on this one. I think the big answer is all of us. I think for far too long, we have thought about and talked about childcare and education as a us and them conversation. Sometimes them conversation in terms of those people, those parents who need childcare or need better childcare, and more, even when, as I think about the amazing work that iTask has been doing about the first 1,000 days and ensuring that families, particularly who may not have had access to very high quality early education, early, not just childcare, but early high quality education for their children, healthcare, the work that takes place in the home and outside the home. But often that's still there, right? The us designing and resourcing and them who are going to receive. I think if we've learned nothing else over the last 18 months is that it's all us. It's all of us who are trying to figure out what is the very best way. And I say in every room that I'm in, I am very blessed with a lot of resources. My family and I are very blessed with a lot of resources. And the last year and a half have tried and strained all of that, right? And the ability to be able to make sure that my 8 and 10-year-old really were able to thrive in education and be well performing, while 2 working parents were also made their organizations thrive and be well resourced. And so I think then as we think about families who are even more strained and we wonder why they are exiting the workforce, we've got to think about, do we have enough high quality childcare that is also culturally and racially responsive? And there are solutions out there, some happening in our state right now, where our state's Economic Development and Employment Office has started to invest in very high quality and racially responsive childcare that doesn't meet the mold that before we thought was just the gold standard, but is the gold standard for those communities and families. And I think we're going to have to start to marry those solutions and strategies with marrying the economic development strategies that say, how can employers invest in those tools and strategies as a way of keeping the workforce in? How can education outlets invest in those as a way of making sure, yes, it's high quality and it's preparing children to thrive when they get to school? How can healthcare institutions invest in those racially responsive childcare delivery solutions, right? How can communities, how do we go all in? But for sure, employers have to be at the table, because this is now an economic crisis. Our inability over the last 20 years to not be in the us and them, but the all of us has now made it an economic crisis. And we've got to be sure that we get as creative as possible. And we don't do it. What my fear is right now, I'm seeing it where we're solving maybe a neighborhood at a time, or we're solving it for a population at a time, where we've got maybe a language worker. So I'm seeing right now some solutions in some Latino communities where we're willing to pilot it very small. We don't have time for that. We have to now get creative and scale very rapidly. And we have to be willing to fail. We have to be willing to get some things wrong and then get up really quickly and go rapidly in the same way that we would do in a tech sector or a bio sector. We have to be willing to do that with these solutions that feel charitable or soft, because right now it is about all of us thriving. And this is too critical to get wrong for too long.
Yeah, thanks so much. Laura, Tim, other reactions, the same question. I mean, what has to be true for us to, in a more transformational way, address what we have known was a challenge for a long time? How do we get agreement?
A couple of things I would highlight here, building on some of the comments Tawanna made. First of all, I couldn't agree more. This is all of us. I think if we have recognized anything in the last 18 months, it is that our childcare infrastructure is just simply not robust enough for any group of people, but particularly the communities that are often most challenged by the pandemic, the Black and Hispanic and other communities that Tawanna referenced. What I would highlight that we have to build on is the work that has been done. Tawanna referenced the first 1,000 days. There are many similar initiatives out there. We in Minnesota have, at the University of Minnesota, some of the world's leading experts on early childhood development, and particularly 0 to 3. We know through the Masonic Institute that's being built at the University of Minnesota, this is going to be the world's leading think tank, right? So we understand what needs to be done, and we have some great practitioners out there who are taking the research and doing something with it. Think of it, Way to Grow, NAS, Northside Child Development. These places know what to do, right? So Kathy, the issue for us is, if any place in the country should be able to figure this out, we should.
Right.
We have the academic expertise and we have the role models, and we should be the place where we can collaborate and talk about this stuff. So all of the ingredients are here. I think this is simply, as Tawanna has alluded to, a matter of can we come together around this critically important issue, build on all the capabilities that we have here, right? We don't have to go very far, and make something happen. And if we can't, that would be very disappointing. And I know, countless groups are working on this in collaboration, and I think I'm hopeful, but we must get this right.
Yeah. And I'll ask the question in a provocative way, and back to the overall kind of theme of this webinar. Does having additional sources of revenue, different revenue, new revenue, more revenue coming at this challenge give us the opportunity to think differently about how to organize the table, how to organize the body of work? Because I totally agree with something you said earlier, Tim. We as a region have a world-class reputation for collaboration. We also have dismal statistics on our ability to tackle some of these problems. And so figuring out a different way seems so important. It's the reason, again, we wanted to ask these questions. How can we think about this potentially once in a generation level of investment and change the way we might be thinking about solution? And I don't have an answer. I don't have an agenda here. It seems to me it's one that we have such agreement that we own this problem. We have got to do better by our children and the people who live and work here and want to raise healthy, good kids. Does having more money give us the opportunity to create a different process?
So I'll just chime in quickly and then turn it back to Tim and Tawanna on this. But, I think the challenge we have is, this really will be one-time money. It's not going to be, so we have to find ways to, invest in programs and pilot things that can then be adapted to and sustained over time. So there's a lot of opportunity for our group of thinkers here to pull together what that would look like. What have been successful pilots? And the spending on any of this money can be anywhere from over 5 to 8 years. So there is that is a relatively short period of time to start seeing significant change. So I would put it back to Tawanna and Tim on there thinking of how that, what some successful pilots have been that maybe would be invested in and continue to invest in, or what they're thinking on those type of investments to be able to sustain them longer term.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we've advocated for across the board with these dollars is the opportunity to incentivize employer action, and in particular in increasing wages in order to stabilize the economy and close stagnant wage gaps that have not only been stagnant over 10 years, but that we've seen increase over the last 5 years. And while those don't particularly translate over to this industry, we do know that the child care wages are one of the biggest barriers in not only getting to quality child care, but in getting quality child care in communities of color, retaining those workers and retaining then parents in other positions, right? Because they want their children in racially responsive childcare that's also high quality. And so I think we do have an opportunity as we look at other states that have begun to deploy some of these dollars in increasing for short term, and the short term being a few years, some of the wages in positions with plans for how then those employers take over that bump up in wages. So if we're talking about a job that might pay $13 today, can that job begin to pay $15 or $18 an hour using some of these funds over time? And can you help then those owners, forgive me, I'm in Nashville downtown, so I'm surrounded by sirens, but can you then have plans that then support the owners of those childcare facilities in building wealth over time such that they can scale and take over those wage subsidies, government funded wage subsidies over time? And I think those strategies are ones that we have to look at that are not only financially and economically stabilize workers, but also owners and build wealth in communities. And we have more than enough entrepreneurial support programs taking place throughout the metro that we should be able to couple these strategies together in order to really double down on it. And it's necessary in order for childcare workers to thrive.
And Kathy, could I build on
Please.
both Laura and Tawanna's comments? I think we need to distinguish money and process. And what I mean by that is we have to get better in this region at hearing voices we haven't heard before. And Tawanna and Laura touched on this previously. So the fact that there is more money is very nice, and we should take advantage of that. But even if there weren't more money, we have to change the way that we go about creating solutions to a lot of these problems. And I think, with Tawanna's and many other inspirations on this, we're beginning to make changes. We got a long way to go on that front, right? And we should particularly do it now because there are dollars at stake. But even if there weren't dollars at stake, we have to change the process and the way that we go about doing these things. And that's engaging. It's lots of things we've been talking about, right? So the dollars are an accelerator, but we shouldn't overly focus on that. We've got to have different voices coming to help us develop solutions. That's going to change the process. The dollars help accelerate that.
I'm gonna thanks for that, Tim, and I'm gonna actually lift up a comment that I'm seeing in our queue here from Tim Tormon, who says more money will only work if we think differently. The same approach will only provide the same results. He targets training and education as a place where we have to particularly do some new thinking, and says, I realize this is not news to the panel, but we need leaders who embrace change, not fear it. One of the things I want to come back to on that, and maybe I'm going to start with you, Tim, is when we talk about using public funding to change the wage structure in a sector, whether it's home care, which is another place where our agency is doing a lot of work, or it's in childcare, you're messing with the economy. You're messing with the market in some respect. Talk as a business leader at U.S. Bank. How do those discussions about using federal dollars to alter wage structures, how do you guys process that as business leaders?
Well, I think if you take an issue like childcare, right, and this is one of the benefits of having lots of people in the community talking about this issue. I think, Kathy, what has become clear, and perhaps it should have been clearer before, but it's become clear in the last 18 months, is the system doesn't work. It's not a market that's working well, right? And so it doesn't have the right, the system is far too fragmented. There were 6,000 childcare providers. It doesn't attract doesn't pay enough for labor to be stable and have the right skills and all that. So that's not working. So this is not a question of, is government getting involved in a market and making it worse. The market's not working, right? And so what we need are a set of changes in the rules on this particularly crucial topic to say, we've got to come up with a better system for whatever set of reasons our existing system is not working. So let's step back and look at how we can create a system that works, as Tawanna said, for everybody and provides the stability of childcare. And so I don't think this is a question of, is the government messing in the market? The market's not, whatever system we have is not working, so we need a fix. And government and companies will all have to be part of that solution.
All right, I got another provocative question here from someone who's saying, have you considered whether the Constitution allows for this? That is, can the federal government infuse new money that sort of changes our system? None of you are constitutional lawyers, so I won't put you to the question. But it seems, and I think the questioner is raising something that we know is out there, that there is resistance to the idea that governmental intervention is something to be celebrated. Reaction to that, yeah.
So I'll just chime in on that. I mean, I think because so much is going down to local and local levels as well, I think that you have kind of that distribution that people are talking about, and this concern over the states getting an influx of money. I mean, it's really going to local communities. I think the piece with transformational change that we want to see can get harder when you go down to local communities, because with the pandemic, you have seen that, a lot of the base revenue funds for these cities have been depleted, right? So is this money going to plug holes, which is okay in those budgets, because then it doesn't necessarily lead to further tax burdens maybe on their citizens. But again, we've got, some of the largest cities receiving this money, and those large cities are also where we want to see these transformational changes happening. So I think that distribution of the funding is going to be really interesting to watch. Just when you read about it, a lot of holes are being plugged, which is great. Again, like if you need to repair all the sewers in a city, that's a very costly tax burden, to those property holders. But at the same time, are we then looking at that transformational change in the larger context that we need, and especially on our, workers and the childcare systems that we're talking about right now, which are so incredibly instrumental in everyone's success in the state.
Yeah. Well, I'm watching the time here, and I'm going to give my speakers a chance for one last shot. But I will say, when we talk, the basic premise of this discussion, that they're potentially once in a generation levels of funding, how should we be thinking about them? And are they opportunities for transformational change or systems change? And another listener has just thrown in an interesting notion. So I picked on childcare as a place where, to Tim's point, the market isn't working. This person observes the market's not really working for childcare, for home care, for housing, or for healthcare. And maybe those are arguable points, but I think it sort of speaks again to this notion that as a society, as a nation, we've got some real pressure points that we have an opportunity to address if we can figure out how best to do that. So I'm going to maybe really quick round robin. If you could say one more thing about this topic, what do you want to make sure we take away from it? Tim, you can go first.
I'd say, Kathy, we do have a moment. This is a moment. We've got a lot of great capabilities. We're great collaborators. We need new voices in the collaboration to get the best answers, and we have a certain sense of urgency. But I think if we act and we build on our past strengths, we bring in many new voices, and we have a chance now to really fundamentally change the trajectory. So I think the premise of this whole discussion is exactly right, and hope all of your listeners will be getting engaged, if they aren't already, in what is really a very special moment for us to leverage our strengths and to get better at the same time.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Tawanna.
Thank you so much for hosting this. I would close by saying that if we had closed nationally the Black wage, education, housing, and investing gaps 20 years ago, it would have added nearly $16 trillion to the economy, according to Citi. And by taking similar actions right now that we have the opportunity to do, we could add $5 trillion to the GDP by 2026. That's dollars that benefits every single household across this country, and certainly here in Minnesota. And it's worth it to take the time to fail forward and fail fast, and to succeed forward and fast together. And it's worth it. And we're all in, and look forward to partnering with listeners.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Tawanna. Laura, you get the last word.
So I would say too, that I'm optimistic about what Minnesota can do with this money. We've got to get the money now, so certainly the ARP funds have been distributed, but there is this gridlock in Congress that's there today. And, we've seen similar gridlocks over climate change, over childcare, over many of the discussions in housing at our state level. We need to push to get this moving in Congress. I'm excited that they have there's this pressure right now to do them together, because I do think that if you just do the infrastructure bill, the other gets a little bit sidelined. And we've talked right now that we can't just be plugging the deficit holes. We have to be investing in transformational change. And so, as the commenter said, markets aren't working right now. So we have to infuse those dollars into the markets to make that transformational change in our communities. And I think we've got the opportunity to do it. We need Congress to act. And I would say this is time for everybody to raise their voices with our federal leaders and the state and our cities, and our communities will need to
Great.
take it from
Thanks,
there.
Laura. Thank all of you for being with us. This session was recorded and available for people who were not able to listen in full or able to sign in this morning. So we'll be letting people know that. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, John Blackshaw, who's just going to talk a minute about what's going to come next, because we do think there are there's some evidence of some good experiments starting, and we're going to be looking forward to doing that before the end of the year. John, I'll turn it to you. Thanks again, Tawanna, Laura, Tim.
Thanks you, Kathy. I hope everyone found it to be a fascinating discussion. And thank you for joining us. I want to specifically thank our panelists for Arick, Jeff, Laura, Tim, and Tawanna. Thank you very much. Your brilliance and your insights is just a small example of the brilliance we have in this community to help us navigate through these issues. I do want to say, as a follow-up to Kathy, we are going to continue this series of discussions to dive a little bit deeper into some of the subject areas that we touched on today. I think hopefully everybody will, you'll be looking for some notices coming out. I think some of the topics we're going to follow up with are going to be on the climate, healthcare, and maybe housing as well. So please look for those notices as we continue this discussion about government funding and the intersection between our communities and how we best make some decisions about how to take advantage of this transformational time in front of us. If any of you have a question or comment, please share it with us. You can go to send those through our email at tunheim.com. You'll also be able to find a link to this discussion, as Kathy said, on our website. So I want to close with that and thank you everybody for your participation, and thanks for listening.